If I'm sitting here looking at a photo of someone's ceramics, and without you being able to see it, I describe this work as distinctively flowing and soft, yet crisp porcelain forms with a signature pastel glaze color. Odds are, you might guess that I am looking at the work of Martha Grover. And it's no wonder Martha's visual voice is so powerful and easily recognizable, because she's been focused on that singular voice for over 23 years. But how did that come to be? A stroke of genius and inspiration that struck like a lightning bolt? Quiet, solitary contemplation? Organized, structured academic discussion? The pursuit of our own artistic voice is often at the forefront of many conversations for us as artists. And yet, actually finding it still often can feel like mystical alchemy. But in today's conversation with Martha, she shares some very pragmatic ways that her own distinct style came into the world and continues to evolve. And you know I love pragmatic ways. But not only that, we discuss the realities of being a studio potter in 2025. How many other factors go into that actually being possible, and balancing all of those other factors in order to protect the precious studio time for artistic exploration. And spoiler alert, my friends, bigger is not always better. Unless, of course, you're collaborating with Martha to recreate one of her signature pieces at a scale never seen before in front of thousands of potters in real time. But you'll just have to keep on listening for that full story, right after this brief word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by The Community, your creative business support system with over 100 makers from all around the world. Have you ever finished a podcast episode wishing you had someone to talk through the ideas with? That's exactly what The Community provides. Both the practical education you need to run your side hustle or dream full-time making business, through our quarterly masterclasses on topics like finances, marketing, and SEO, plus the emotional support of fellow makers who truly understand what it's like to try and make a living from the things we make. It's like having both a business school designed specifically for artists and a team of colleagues who actually get what you're going through. No more figuring it out all alone or late-night Google searches that are less than helpful. Whether you're joining one of our virtual co-working sessions, diving into our growing masterclass resource library, or participating in a giveaway that actually helps you finish a big project, your membership also supports this podcast while giving you the tools to build the creative life that you are dreaming of. There are heaps more resources and events happening inside of the community, but I know we all want to get into this interview. So just click on over to makersplaybook.com/community to learn more about the perks of membership and support the creation of this very podcast in the process. One more time, that's makersplaybook.com/community. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 14 years, Rebecca Ikes Cara. Hey, Martha, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for having me.
I forgot to tell you before I just said hello that the first question I always ask everybody is to introduce themselves. So, surprise!
Here we go.
Right? I feel like you've probably done it before, but whatever informal, formal version you want to go with.
So I am Martha Grover. I am a full-time studio potter living in Bethel, Maine. I finished graduate school in 2007 and have been, I did a series of residencies and whatnot along the way, but I've been making my living as a potter kind of ever since I finished graduate school, with other things mixed in, which I'm sure we'll get to in our conversation today.
We were just saying before we hit record, we're recording this the week after NCECA, and you were saying like, well, we just go from one thing to the next. That's what we do. And I was like, maybe everybody needs to know just how much we do that. So
I feel like it's a constant juggling act between teaching and making and, keeping the work fresh and in everyone's faces and kind of all the stuff that it takes to do that. So
I feel like you're in an interesting period of time in terms of finishing formal schooling and then stepping into a professional practice, in that it's that era of you understand life before social media.
This is true.
And, having a making practice without Instagram, but also, I imagine, are comfortable with the platform or are comfortable, it's not a complete separation of kind of the old school potters who built their entire career before all that and don't really completely need to worry about it now versus the new ones.
It's interesting for me looking back. So I finished undergrad in 2002. And when I applied for graduate school, it was still slides. So there was still the headache of you had to actually get film and have the correct lights. And one set of slides that I took in to have developed at the photography place, they actually had like the wrong ingredient in the tank, and the things came back and they were all orange, and I had to reshoot everything, and there was no digital record of it. And then by the time I finished graduate school, no one was taking slides anymore and it was all digital. So it's kind of an interesting 3 years to be going through academia where most of it was analog, but they were starting to change everything over to digital. And then I actually remember during my long-term residency at the Archie Bray Foundation, sitting at a table with Sunshine Cobb, talking about this new Instagram thing that was happening and having her show me her Instagram feed and being like, "Oh, well, that's interesting." Yeah, so definitely kind of my upbringing was sort of right in the middle of all of that happening. And it is interesting to think about younger potters and developing a voice and a body of work with so many voices coming into the conversation. Of course, I was in academia and had all of those voices, all of the folks that were in school with me, as well as my professors, constant critique and looking at things. But that's very different from having the entire world being able to see your progress in your work. And I even think now, as people's bodies of work change, how does that voice of the public change their thoughts on their work? Can be a great thing. Oh my gosh, I've got all these people I can get feedback from. But then at the same time, those voices can be saying, no, that isn't good, or no, you should do it this way, or what about that, versus letting the internal artist come into your thoughts on what you're making. And I think that is definitely a big balancing act that artists have to deal with now. When does the work become public? When do you keep it private? When is it your voice being strongest versus the world? So it's definitely a balancing act.
And also, which voices do you listen to?
That's true.
Because the thing I noticed for social media is you can see a thread of comments of, oh my God, I love this versus this is crap. And it's like, well, you don't know one username from the next. Whereas at least in a, for lack of a better word, traditional controlled situation, you have a person who has been deemed professional enough to give you feedback, to be qualified to give feedback. And then you have a room of peers who are all, as Brene Brown has put it, in the ring. They're doing similar kind of work, working through these same questions. And so therefore the feedback is,
there's a vetting process that has
yes.
happened to those voices. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also, so as you just said, I'm just coming off of NCECA. And while at NCECA, I did a collaborative piece with a friend of mine, Herrick Smith, who is a big pot thrower. And he took one of my pots and scaled it up. And, what an arena to be doing that kind of a collaborative piece over the course of 3 days. I mean, there were 7,000 people that potentially saw us working on that. And it was really funny. Herrick posted a video that many, 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 many people have watched now. And within an hour, there was someone who had put kind of a trolly comment on it. And he was like, I guess we've made it, Martha. We've got our first troll. But, in all of that, there's humor in that. But then at the same time, I think as people, we tend to see the negative much more highlighted than we do. You can have 1,000 positive comments, and then that one negative one definitely starts those seeds of doubt often. So again, just as you were saying, like if the voices are not curated at all in that environment, and so it can be difficult to kind of put those away. So I know, for me, when I am trying out something brand new, I don't tend to post it when it is in its infancy, when I kind of need to, kind of keep it in the womb a little bit longer until I feel like my thoughts on it are resolved and I'm confident enough in my decisions that I'm ready to let those other voices and eyes into the studio with me, because I know that that negative feedback, even if it's minute compared to the positive feedback, can definitely take over one's decisions going forward.
And that's not to say that critique isn't important. I think it's massively important to, any of us can have somebody cheerleading us on. The metaphor that comes to mind is a ridiculous one, but I think about, there's friends that I don't care to go shopping with because they'll tell me I look nice in just about anything. I want to go with a friend who's going to be like, absolutely not. Don't wear that color. You want to wear this.
This is not helpful for you. Yeah,
Exactly. Like, not doing you any favors. Let's try something else.
exactly. Exactly. But then also, who are you taking that critique from? You're going to take the friend shopping with you who you enjoy their aesthetic rather than someone that you're like, oh my God, why are they wearing that? That's maybe not the voice that, that you want helping you out, if you will.
I need the one who appreciates comfort shoes and not stilettos for
Yeah.
sure.
But I think, if we can somehow surround ourselves with those voices that are going to give us critical feedback, important feedback, look with an eye, understanding, kind of the elements of art, principles of design, how what our source material is, what that end goal is for the work, and can have that deeper conversation. Again, more than just the like, oh, that thing is whatever that a troll-ish person might put onto your Instagram feed. So for me, the folks that I was in graduate school are still great voices to have around, as well as through residency programs. It's great to kind of have those few people that you can say, hey, I'm working on this new thing. What do you think? And know that they're not going to just give you the positive, hey, it's great, but also that they'll take the time to look and be considered. And so it's been really valuable for me to have those folks around that I can ask those questions of and put those kind of infant ideas out there and see if it seems like to them I'm also going in a good route.
I think the point that you just made about understanding what you're trying to do also, right? I can look at something and maybe it's not my aesthetic, but that doesn't really matter if what the person is trying to get across is coming across.
Very true. Very true. I feel like I've had sometimes my greatest critiques from people that make work that's completely different than mine, and they're not saying, oh, this is, my aesthetic. I absolutely love it. They're saying, oh, I can understand what you're trying to do with this edge or with that foot or what the relationship between those parts are. And yes, it furthers the emotion that you're trying to get out of this piece, or kind of how you want all those parts to come together. It's working or it's not working. Or
I think this is a beautiful segue right now for some of the questions that we have from our community members. I post who I'm interviewing and then they get a chance to kind of throw in some questions before we actually hit record. Sarah was asking, how long did it take you to land on your own style, whether it was this slow, gradual evolution or a quicker journey?
it's kind of interesting for me. So as I said, I finished undergraduate in '02 and then graduate school in '07. And those 5 years in between, while being in graduate school and then leading into graduate school, I had some interesting things happen. So I went to Bennington College for undergrad and I actually studied architecture. But by the time I got done, I was spending more time in the clay studio than I was in the architecture studio, and definitely knew that I was having beautiful dreams about pots and nightmares about architecture. So there was something in that was saying, Martha, it's making you want to go this way rather than that way. So I went and did a special student year at Syracuse University. And while I was at Bennington, I had endless amounts of clay. There wasn't you only get so many pounds. It would use whatever you want. Great big kilns, could do anything that I liked. I had kind of, I guess it was like 10 by 20 foot space that I shared with one other student. We had a big studio space and I was making big pots, like 2 to 4 feet tall, coil thrown, largish scale work. And I got to Syracuse and I all of a sudden had half a table and two little shelves that were about 8 inches tall and maybe 24 inches across. And I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to make these big pots? I don't have space to put the parts and pieces. There's nowhere to store them. This does not seem possible. And I was porcelain curious. So I bought my first bag of porcelain while I was there. And at the same time, the first month I was at school, David McDonald gave me the assignment to replicate a historical vessel. And, it's a common thing that you're assigned in school, but I had never done that before. And I had just gotten introduced to George Orr. And so I replicated a George Orr piece, which, if you don't know George Orr's work, he was kind of the king of altering. He would take pots, throw them super, super thin, and then twist them, fold them in all kinds of really interesting ways. And that act of first working with porcelain and then trying to kind of make a collapsed pot somehow look intentional really kind of got into my fingers. And right after that, I did a series of 5 gravy boats. And I remember when they came out of the kiln, there was like this light bulb that came on that I was like, I don't know what this is, but that's pretty exciting. And so kind of from September 2002 until now, which is April 2025, so that's, a pretty long chunk of history, I have been throwing and altering porcelain. So I'm sort of an oddity because I started graduate school with a portfolio of thrown and altered porcelain, and I finished graduate school still making thrown and altered porcelain that is functional and is kind of in a pastel, colorful palette. So I don't know if that means that I'm just tenacious and really have this idea that I want to stick with, or that I'm not terribly creative and I'm still doing the exact same thing. But I have been kind of working on this body of work for the last 23 years, which it seems rather crazy to me, but I love it. And like so many potters, I am fascinated by the minutia, that I can have a whole board of mug bodies, and the changes in millimeters between one and the next is totally fascinating. And I think the same holds true with my entire body of work. I will change something a quarter of an inch, and then I'll bring my husband Josh into the studio and I'm like, look at this amazing new pot that I am making. And he'll look at the ones from yesterday and the ones from today and be like, so what's different? And I'm like, no, but look, it's a quarter of an inch taller or wider or shorter, or it has one more handle, or
Josh and I need to compare notes. You and Francesco would love to have like you two could easily share a studio, and we would need to like claw you out of there to just, I don't know, even show the work maybe, because it's like, no, that is a set. To everyone else, that is a set. No one else actually understands that that curve is different. I
Mhm.
see what you mean. However,
However, so I think that, kind of fascination in the little changes has definitely kind of kept me in this thrown and altered porcelain realm for quite a while. So I would say my voice kind of started with that set of 5 gravy boats, and then I've just continued to kind of push it forward and change it. And the pots definitely look different to start out with, but in looking at images of them, you can see that my hand is in them. They already in that infancy sort of look like Martha Grover. Kind of like when you look at a baby picture and you're like, all right, I see it. I see, the
you
ears are
look
the
like your dad.
same, or
Okay.
yeah, yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
I'm really curious how many people can pinpoint that specific, to know that it was those gravy boats. I find really interesting. I'm trying to think of even, when somebody can say, ah, there it is. Like, here
That's
you
that
are. I
moment.
found
Yeah.
you. I think that's wonderful. I'm gonna have to like find a picture of these gravy boats now
I'll
because
have to send one to you. They're actually a couple of them are still at my mom's house, so they are still kind of accessible, and I have images of them as well, so
nice. Well, I will say you mentioned your glaze design, and pretty much every other comment. Also, I should just take a screenshot of what everybody wrote because it's wonderful, lovely things, less specific questions, but phrases like soft yet crispy, as well as undulating shapes, and just the descriptions are wonderful. But the common thread through everybody also between Bill and Jenna and Sheila and Ian are glazes and how distinctive it is, how that pastel feeling that you're getting, which I don't feel like is common in pottery at all. You either kind of have earth tones or bright colors,
bright
maybe.
colors, yeah.
I'm not sure. But I'm assuming that was an intentional selection, but how did you come to that palette color? That's was Jenna's question specifically.
So I think for me, I felt like, in my journey of understanding my work, that I first needed to take color out of the equation and understand what glaze, surface, opacity, translucency, matte versus glossy, what that was bringing to the work. So for a semester while I was in graduate school, I said, okay, I'm going to take color out of the question and just look at how, whether the glaze, if you see through it or you don't, if it's shiny or it isn't, how does that change how one perceives the form? So I gathered a whole bunch of glaze recipes of transparent, opaque, satin, gloss, matte finishes, and then started putting them onto the pots in different ways. And at a certain point, I was like, I'm masking off this and masking off that. What happens if this glaze gets layered over that glaze? What happens if that goes under versus over, and what happens in between? And somewhere in all of that, I discovered the two glazes that I'm using now, which is a transparent clear that is shiny and a satin matte white that is opaque. And when I layer them with the transparent clear on first and then satin matte white on top, they do what is called a phase separation, which means that that first layer of clear melts first, and it actually kind of cracks the glaze layer that's on top of it. And then when that second layer of glaze melts, it kind of makes this rivulating surface. And I was like, ooh, that's kind of interesting. And then when I started to bring color back into the equation, I was spending a lot of time looking at various different plants. I really love looking at orchids and kind of thinking about how those flowers employ color along the edge of a flower, the interior of the flower, and how it often fades between one color and the next, and then uses striping or speckling to kind of draw in the various pollinators. So I started out thinking about what I wanted the character of the surface to be before I started thinking about what I wanted the color to be. And I think in, the evolution of color, I definitely always was pairing green with a bright color, kind of thinking about if you cut open a cantaloupe or a watermelon or
Flower.
look at a flower, you look at the leaves versus the blossom. I've gotten a little bit more creative where it's kind of any color can go with any color now. And why not have a yellow fade into a blue? That would be great. Whereas kind of early on, I was a little bit more rigid of like, I haven't seen a flower do that, so that's not possible. But things have kind of gotten a little bit looser in those sort of, I do this, but I don't do that realm now. But that's kind of how it started, was first with the quality of the glaze I wanted, and then thinking about how plants employ color and patterns in different ways.
What I love about what you just said, though, is the idea of almost paring back in order to move forward, like giving it's not a restrictive thing in my mind, but maybe somebody's going to hear it, is that to remove a lot of things in order to progress forward and to focus just on one, like you were saying, the quality of the surface before you added color back in.
I feel like I heard a great quote recently, and I cannot remember the quote, neither who it was from, but the idea of it was that the greatest creativity sometimes comes when we have very set parameters. And it's like when you have walls on either side, it gives you a space to then be expressive within. And sometimes if you have the entire world to work with, it's just too much. But if you kind of pare that back, then it's like, okay, what can I do within this space? And for me, again, thinking about surface, I first wanted to come at it kind of from the ceramic materiality of it, of, what does glaze bring to this object? And then start to think about color. Again, I think color has so many different connotations for people. I like purple. I don't like yellow. I love orange. I don't like this, or, those things, or this has a memory of this particular time and place, that it can be very subjective as far as people's response to it.
How much of this do you feel like, and this, as I'm asking it, I know it's an impossible question because you only know this one version of life. So there's no way to know where you would be without. But I can't help but wonder how much of that time to explore the minutia is kind of encouraged in the traditional setting of graduate school, and how those of us who came to clay later in life might be able to help ourselves give ourselves these kind of walls in order to move forward, right? Because there is so much, I don't know, language of art school, if you will.
Yeah. I feel incredibly fortunate that I was able to go through kind of traditional academia. I think it did give me time and space. It's interesting now, I am teaching in a program called the Cohorts program that Simon Levin started. I am one of the mentors for that this year. And I've got a couple mentees who are wanting to explore their work and push things further and, try things that they've never done before. but they also have the constraint of they make pots and sell them to pay for life. And it's an interesting thing of how do you continue to make a living while experimenting. And I think for those folks, it's been really great enrolling in this cohorts program because it gives them a responsibility not only to me that they know they're going to meet with me every other week, but to themselves of like, hey, I've set aside this year to really explore my work. And so sometimes I think, it's again having those parameters that if you give yourself an assignment, maybe it's that you're having a conversation with someone every week or two or month or something like that. Or if you join a critique group, there are lots of groups on Facebook that one can become a part of that are there to kind of help each other look at work and make it better, or a local art group, or, finding a friend that you can say, hey, I really want to push my work forward and have someone to kind of be accountable for. I think that can really help when you're not in that academic setting, kind of almost making your own little graduate program if you can, and giving yourself kind of those crazy assignments of, what happens if you do replicate a historical piece? Does that change your finger knowledge in some way, that tactile touch knowledge of a form? What happens if you limit yourself to a couple different glazes? How do you utilize them to do something different? So I think if we can set up those kind of questions for ourselves that have some limits, sometimes it helps with creativity.
The one thing Francesco and I have talked about a lot over the years, because we have, this one item, and ironically, I don't even have it next to me, that has sold very well. And there was a period of time with the giant mug, as people have heard me talk about, where without restriction, he was just making mugs constantly and was going to get really burnt out on them, or slash is burnt out on them. But in the middle of, because it is part of our livelihood and something, it was kind of like, hey, you want to hit page one of a thing like Etsy when you're trying to sell stuff to pay for life and dog food. But what we came to was figuring out a way for the production schedule to say, okay, I'm going to make, I think I don't know, he puts 12 on a board, whatever, the exact number doesn't matter, but every 4 weeks, I'm going to make 24. And when they sell, they sell. And when they're out, they out. And then I make the next batch. And it gave that time constraint of, I'm going to keep making these because they continue to sell. And that's important for our livelihood. But then also it didn't fill every single moment for him not to be able to create a new item or explore more glazes, or
to kind of restrict it and say, okay, this will satisfy our need. And even though people might want more, to say, no, this is all we're doing. Which, I think in a lot of things, it's important to set those limits. I think about, so for me in my studio practice, in order to make a living, pay the bills, have all of those things, I do teaching. So I teach workshops here, there, and everywhere. I was just in Florida last month. I go and teach one in Portland this coming weekend, but I only do 6 to 8 of those a year. I had one year that I did 15 and I was like, okay, this is too much. But, setting like, okay, I'm only going to do this many of those at a time because I know I have to travel. That takes time away from the studio, the, mental space of going someplace else and coming home. That can take some transitional time out of your making schedule. But then also my studio space, since we moved here to Maine about 10 years ago, I inherited a 6,000 square foot kind of warehouse building that my father used to run a machine shop out of. And when my husband and I moved here for 2 potters, that space is huge. And we kept having people ask us, do you guys do classes? Do you do classes? Will you teach us how to? And so we now have a community studio. And we started out pretty small. We only had 3 extra wheels, and now we're up to 11 wheels in the classroom. I added someone to the wait list yesterday, and they were number 101. So I've got 101 people on the wait list.
oh my God.
Which is crazy. I mean, I'm in small town Bethel, Maine. There's only 2,000 people here. Like, it's not a huge community, but
Percentage per capita. What is
it's
that?
crazy. I mean, people are coming from other towns from further away, but Josh and I have decided we're only going to do those 4 classes a week. They come for their class time. So classes are on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then they get open studio Thursday, and that's it. So there's the potential to do studio membership, to do 8 classes a week, to do more. but I still want to be able to make pots. And the community studio, it pays the property tax, it keeps the lights turned on, it pays the building insurance and the business insurance and all of that. But, with those 4 classes, that profit is enough. And though it could grow bigger, I still, again, want to be able to be an artist and have more time in the week dedicated to my studio practice than to our community studio. And, it's those setting limits, setting the parameters. And within that, I'm still able to have my creative time and have a time when there aren't other people around, to be able to be a practicing artist. Yeah.
I love how intentional that decision is because the conversation around enough has been a big one for us, especially as I transition careers out of event photography because there's definitely, and it's not just the world I was in. I mean, think the world in general for all of us, the common voice is more, more, more,
Yes.
grow, grow, grow.
And I think that, American kind of commercialist, capitalist, everything is like, if it can get bigger, it should get bigger, right?
Why
But
wouldn't you?
why
Like,
wouldn't
yeah.
you? I mean, the business is there to be had, the money is there to be made. But I think, especially as a maker of functional objects who is constantly talking about what is the experience with that object, you can't help but translate that into what is the experience of my life. And do I want to be busy every single moment of the day? And, it's hard to be creative within that grind as well. You need time for creativity to happen. And if you're only slotting it in of like, I've got an hour to be in the studio or 2 hours on this day or 1 hour on that day, it's hard to say, well, I'm going to be creative on Tuesday at 3. That just doesn't, or like, oh, I want to make a new body of work. All right, that's going to happen on Friday. For me, it doesn't happen that way. So I need to be able to make the space for that to happen.
Especially if that new body of work involves glaze research, at least for us, because, oh my
It's
God,
huge.
it's years, years.
Kiln after kiln after kiln. And, doing textiles is one thing, but actually seeing it in production is a whole other thing
Yep.
of, yep.
Yep. Okay, I have an embarrassing confession that I'm going to blame this on the house renovation brain that has been happening and just like too many sounds of power tools over the past 3 weeks. I completely forgot your husband was a potter. And selfishly, lady to lady, I kind of find that hilarious because historically it's always one guy and his partner and not like whatever. So I think that's hilarious. But it just
So
opens up a whole world of questions for me.
So it's interesting. So Josh, when we met, he was the retail manager for the Archie Bray Foundation clay business. So he started at the clay business as a clay maker. So he was one of the guys in the back, dumping big bags of whatever powder into the machine to actually make clay. And then he slowly worked his way into the front room of the supply shop and worked his way up to retail manager. So I always used to joke when we were in Montana that he was my dealer. He was the guy that sold me my
With
clay
all
and
the
my wheel and
powder,
my kiln and all of that. But then
bags of powdered material.
exactly. And then when we moved to Maine, Josh decided that he would try out being a full-time potter. And he has always been really interested in kind of objects that have a very specific use. So, he might make shaving scuttles. So these things that I had never heard of before that you mix up shaving foam in, but get, hot water on the outside so the foam is nice and warm when it goes on your, I don't know, or garlic graters.
I was going to say it's the men's version of a garlic grater.
Yeah, yeah. So very specific function. And he also, when we moved here, he took on some restaurant ware orders. He did beer steins for some local breweries. So again, very specific function. But what he found was that he actually really enjoys a 9 to 5 job, that you show up in the morning and the work is there versus being self-employed where you make your schedule. And I think being a potter, there's a lot of trust of I'm making these objects and someone is going to buy them. And instead of finding joy in that freedom, for him, it was very stressful of like, oh, if I make this stuff, is somebody actually going to like it? Every art fair he went to, it was like, well, they didn't buy this, so should I still be making that? And all of those kinds of questions that was just too much stress for him. So, though he is still a potter, he teaches one of our classes and he makes pots and sells some stuff locally. He now has a different full time job. He actually works for Scut and he is part of their tech support crew. So, they offered him a job during the pandemic when they had redone their phone system and computer system so that their local staff could work remotely. All of a sudden, by doing that, that opened up the door of, wait a second, we don't actually have to hire people in Oregon. If there's someone out there that would be a great addition to our team, even if they're in Maine, that works. So since the pandemic, he has been working for Scut. And, again, thinking finances for us, it has been great. Our health insurance is covered by Scut, which is wonderful. I mean, there's a portion of his paycheck that comes out to cover me, but it's a known entity. And he shows up in the morning and the phone starts ringing, so is this going to work? Are people going to buy it? Is taken out of the equation for him he shows up at work in the morning and the work is there. And it also, Josh is a very patient person and really enjoys helping people with problems. And so, when somebody calls and they're like, I got this error on my kiln, or this isn't working right, or these are the results I'm getting. What can I do to make that better? He loves those conversations of taking the time to be able to help somebody make their work better and make their equipment work better. And so it fits his personality really, really well. So it's been a great partnership for him. And I think Scott enjoys having him as well. So
I love that because I was trying to think of a different phrase other than I love that, because I feel like I say that all the time, but it's such an important piece of the conversation in that I think there's a lot of pressure to go full time, that you have to be full time, that somehow is some moniker of quote unquote success. And I think it is so crucial to be able to self-reflect enough to say, this isn't my happy space. This isn't like, yes, making pots. I enjoy making pots, but to do it full time, there's so many other layers that get put upon it that, not everybody is built for the way self-employment works in 2025, at least.
And I think, the idea of the potter that is just making pots really isn't actually that much of a reality. It's been interesting in the cohorts program. One of the other teachers is Lisa Orr, and she and I have had several conversations about, well, we all wear 6 different hats. It's not just, even though, I think for both of us, people from the outside would say, oh, you're full-time studio potter, which I purport to be, but I also teach workshops. I teach community classes. I am a mentor for cohorts. In selling pots, there's working with galleries. There's selling pots myself online. There's doing wholesale orders. There's, kind of all of these parts and pieces that it isn't just you're in the studio every day making pots. There are so many other components that go into it to make that whole, which I think is the case for most people. It's kind of, we're in that gig work economy, and it holds true in the arts as well. Of, if you're a photographer, you're doing wedding photography as well as your own artistic, it's like juggling all the things.
I love that you think I had artistic photography on the side.
It was an assumption on my part, but
Yeah, no.
bad assumption then.
All good, all good. I'm just laughing at myself for it. But I think that's really important to know. And I also think the notion of doing other things, for me, whether or not it's having a different job or teaching the craft that you make, or, whatever it is that's not making the actual thing, to me, those are all almost in the same category. I don't think of like, oh, well, the person who teaches academically, whether with an institution or with workshops on their own, like that's somehow still more full time than the person who, I don't know, busses tables on the nights and weekends, or gets a seasonal gig, or, or works full time in an office, whatever. Like, I don't see, all of them are doing the funding of making the life so that you can still make the work that you want to make.
It's kind of whatever you have to do to make
Right.
it all fit together and to pay the bills at the end of the month.
Exactly. Like for me, I liken wedding photography in a way to production pottery because everyone was unique and different, but also it's a lot of the same thing over and over and over again.
You're going to need this shot. You're going to need that moment. It's all, it's like it's the same script, just
Yes.
being written in a slightly different language each time.
Yeah, exactly. And for my brain personally, I don't mind production because if the production is what allows me the autonomy and the freedom that I want, then that's easier for my brain than showing up for the 9 to 5. But if the freedom for somebody else is the 9 to 5 and that security so that their brain can be freed up when they walk away from that to create what they want to create, they're serving the same purpose.
This
Like,
is true.
I know on a past episode, I gave some heat to garlic graters because my Italian husband refuses to ever make them, but not in the sense that it's a bad thing to make. I think people could sell a bazillion of them if you want to make them, and there's nothing wrong with that because it can also serve the same purpose. Like we all need whatever it is that's going to fund everything to do the creative stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, there, at the end of the month, you got to pay the bills. And if you're doing that in the way that makes you feel the most comfortable and creative and works for your lifestyle, great. Definitely no judgments of this is better or that is better. It's just kind of how we're all piecing it together.
Yeah, absolutely. It also makes me think that I wonder how much we don't realize about the generations of makers and craftspeople that came before us in terms of what they were piecing together. Because I think, and maybe you've had more conversations about this than I have, me being especially newer to clay. I think there, for a while with social media, there was this perception of, you know, when somebody hears somebody say, I spend 50% of my time with clay and 50% of my time on administrative tasks, for example, a lot of people have said this kind of percentage whose businesses are based around the internet. There's some old school makers that I've heard be like, oh, your job is to make pots, period. Like your job isn't to be on social media. And I'm like, but I don't
You
know if
know,
that's really true for them either. There was something else, clearly.
So I think I've definitely had, like when I finished graduate school, those conversations of like, oh, well, how did you make it work? How did you get to the now? And a lot of people that I talked to had that little windfall that somehow provided them with the situation that they had, whether it was, my father died or my grandparents died and they left me a little bit of money, or I bought a property cheap and then I was able to sell it for more. And so then that funded the current studio. I don't know in our current economy, like I keep thinking about, so in 2020, my husband and I were thinking about buying a house and we were looking at things here in Bethel, Maine. And kind of the medium price for an old farmhouse or something like that was around 200 to 250,000. That was kind of the going rate. And at that moment in time, $250,000 sure sounded like an awful lot of money to us. So we didn't end up buying anything. We built an apartment at the studio. So we live in the 6,000 square foot warehouse building. And, there were lots of decisions that went into that. But we're kicking ourselves now because the exact same farmhouse is now $750,000 5 years later. I mean, how does something triple in price? Where, I keep thinking, gosh, if we had bought that place, even if we'd still built the apartment at the studio, like we could have $500,000 in the bank right now. But we didn't make that happen. So, but definitely those older potters that I had talked to, there were a lot of those situations where they were like, we got this thing that was small, but then we were able to sell it for more, or somehow there was something that was kind of that seed that then grew to become something bigger. And again, with things being as expensive as they are right now, I don't know how that happens. So, they may have indeed spent most of their time in the studio because of something that kind of gave them that seed money to get it started.
It makes me think of, I remember Ben Carter explaining how he got into podcasting in the sense of that generation of so many artists that came up, but in part because of the GI Bill, because so many people had the systemic support to go do a thing after World War II, basically. That's all I'm going to say about it because my history memory. You've got Jackson Pollock. You've got like all these different. I'm not going to say too many names because I'm going to mess up history and a timeline here, and somebody's going to be like, Rebecca, you're dumb.
You're wrong. You're wrong.
But you get the idea.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. But it's one of those things that we don't, until we pause to actually look at it, I feel like it's really easy to forget, like, hey, you're working your butt off to try and make this work. You're working multiple odd jobs or part-time jobs to fund your way through grad school now to figure it out and, looking back at history, looking at potters you admire going,
How did they do this?
"Exactly."
And most likely there was something that helped them along the way too. And, life frankly was cheaper not that long ago. So, and even, like through the 60s, 70s, 80s, definitely cheaper than the 90s, 2000s, and the 2020s. So,
For sure. I feel like the Y2K bug was actually inflation.
yeah, I like that.
I just
Mm.
realized.
Oh,
Oh, shoot.
yeah.
Well, talking about the going I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. I have no good segue for this. But was the impetus for moving I just keep thinking Montana to Maine, okay, temporally in terms of climate, not that different, but geographically, huge jump.
So we are back in my hometown, and Josh's parents are about 15 years younger than my parents. They had kids earlier, and my family had kids later. So my parents are in their 80s now. And it was feeling like coming home every 6, 8 months was just things were changing. And I wanted to be closer to home. So Josh graciously left his beautiful Montana behind so that I could be closer to my family. It actually, as soon as we got off the plane for in Sika in Salt Lake City, he was like, "Oh my gosh, look at the mountains. Look at the sunshine. Look at the beautiful air I can see." I think the hardest thing for him being on the East Coast is this canopy of trees that envelops everything. And I'm in where we are in Maine, we're actually in the White Mountains. We're really close to where Mount Washington is. So for New England, these are as big as they get. But compared to out west in Montana, they are tiny, tiny mountains. And again, covered in trees. And he misses those big, wide open vistas. I had a moment, I was like, is he going to want to get back on the plane when we leave on Saturday?
I'm cackling at myself. Nobody can see me because for a Midwesterner, I'm like, Maine has mountains. What are you talking about? I went to Portland for a photography conference, I don't know, a decade ago. And the idea was to stay a few extra days longer to go on like a snowboarding trip. And I was like, wait a second, I have gone to exactly where you are for the very purpose of like, I'm picturing Vermont.
Enjoying the mountains. Yep. Yep.
Exactly. So I'm like, what do you mean he doesn't have mountains? But I get the open air.
Yep.
I can
Yep.
appreciate
And
that.
Josh grew up in Great Falls, which the mountains are all the way around, but then the city is kind of in the valley. And so you can see for miles and miles and miles and, the weather fronts moving in and kind of seeing that across the landscape he really misses. He also gets challenged with directions here. Because I think in Montana, you can point and say you're going that way, and there's probably a road that goes straight in that direction. Whereas all of New England is based on kind of deer paths through the woods. And so if you want to go west, you got to go south and east first before you'll actually start heading west. So,
And the problem is, I have gotten turned around driving in Boston, especially. And if you miss your turn and you turn around and you have to go through the tunnel that goes under the water, you have to pay the toll multiple times.
to turn around to get back where you wanted to be.
Exactly. And tolls on the East Coast, holy cow, be prepared to take out a loan. I mean, wow. I was like, okay, I didn't mean to get turned around, but
Yeah, we have an expression in New England, and I'll say it with a Maine accent. You can't get there from here. And it's totally that you can't get from this point to that point without going some really weird circuitous route.
yeah, I always joked when I lived in England. It was, I mean, obviously, this was like pre smartphones and all of that, pre Google Maps. But even still now with it, with Google Maps and whatnot, people still carry around an A to Z. And I feel like all of New England needs those as well because
Mhm.
all of the streets and all of the cities are built the same way the UK is built, which is just like no grid in sight.
It's like you took a ball of string and put it together and dropped it on the floor.
You were just like, oop, we need more space. Let's put this here. We need more space. Let's put this here.
Yeah.
Okay.
No logical layout to begin with at all.
We live and learn.
So that was the reason for coming to Maine versus staying in Montana.
What did you guys have to do in terms of being able to move? I mean, it sounds to me, if I remember the timeline correctly, that you were in residency at the Bray, so maybe moving was less upheaval.
So I finished my last residency at the Bray in 22 10, I think. I always have to like pull out my resume and look at the lines to remember the exact dates of things. But then I stayed on and I worked in the gallery, and then I was the education coordinator at the Bray for several years before we decided to move to Maine. And part of that, I think, was, that the Bray didn't want to lose Josh. They really liked having him there. And maybe they liked me a little bit too. So, yeah, I had finished residencies and we were living there, but we were right at that stage of, okay, we're renting. We probably ought to think about buying a house. Is this really where we want to be? Kind of trying to figure all of that out. But we missed Helena. It is an amazing community with wonderful potters. And I feel like it's the kind of place that instead of asking your neighbor, can I borrow a cup of sugar? You can definitely go next door and say, hey, do you have any Nefsi? And they probably will. So
This is hilarious because another Milwaukee potter just came by and got like, I'm not going to remember. I think it might have been Gersley Bull, but I don't, something. We definitely just had
had that kind of a conversation of, do you have a cup of? Yep.
yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
I was also just thinking about, pottery is not a mobile craft exactly. It's not like, okay, you throw up an easel and you start painting again and your paints are the same and everything. I mean, okay, you're staying in the United States, so maybe you can keep some materials, but are you really the stuff you were shipping to Montana on the West, are you really going to now ship that to the East? Just the amount of time it took to get set up again.
So we had about a year that we knew we were going to move, but hadn't yet. And it actually was great when we were at the Bray, since Josh was the guy behind the desk at the Clay Biz, they had a bulletin board for used equipment. And so he was the fellow that everyone would hand their ad to and say, hey, I've got a pug mill, I've got a kiln, I've got a wheel that I'm going to sell. And some of those he would look at and say, this doesn't need to go up on that board. I'll take that one. So we actually moved with quite a bit of equipment. I think we moved 3 kilns and 2 pug mills, plus we each had 2 wheels. And then we brought a whole bunch of dry materials as well as wet clay. We rented the biggest U-Haul that you could rent.
That was exactly my next question.
That sucker was full. For furniture, we had a couch and a bed that collapsed. And we have a Sleep Number mattress, which essentially is an air mattress. So, that rolled up into something the size of a football. And the rest of the moving van was all studio stuff. We were so lucky we didn't have to drive through any way stations that were open, because I think that truck was probably way heavier than it should have been. But, we lucked out. And so when we moved, we brought a lot of studio equipment with us. And then, as I was saying earlier, have definitely added onto it since we've been here. But that kind of gave us a nice little start with these pieces of used equipment that Josh had kind of collected along the way in anticipation of a move.
I was going to say, purchasing equipment in anticipation of a move is not the two things I expect to go together in the same sense.
Well, they were really good deals, so.
Right.
But then it also kind of draws into focus when we moved here. Bethel is not, there are lots of artists here, but compared with Helena, Montana, it is not a thriving clay community. There are kind of 2 local potters. One has retired since we moved here. The other is getting very close to retiring. And I think for us, when we got here after about 6 months, we really realized how much we missed having a clay community, an in-person clay community. I mean, there's, again, wonderful online resources and all of the people that we knew from our years there, from my experiences out in the world. But, face to face, let's talk clay. There really wasn't that much here. So I think for us, starting our community studio was actually more about having people to talk clay with than it was that it was going to be a financial asset to us. I mean, the two luckily are tied hand in hand, but I feel like I'm so grateful that I 3 days a week have other people in my space to be able to be like, hey, have you seen this cool clay thing? Or did you see that great Instagram video? Or have you tried this technique? Or any of that stuff. So it's been really wonderful to share our love of this great material and have it be so well received. It's been really great.
Well, so the piece, I don't remember if I told you this or not, but all of this is happening right now because we will be driving to Chicago in about 3.5 hours to pick up his
Oh,
parents who
fun.
are coming to the United States for the first time ever.
Oh, boy.
And so when we were originally emailing and we didn't have we only have one bathroom in this house, and therefore we didn't have a functioning bathroom when we were renovating it.
That's very important.
Yeah, to have 4 adults in one household, it was like, okay.
This
So,
needs to get done right now.
yeah. I mean, talk about the whole self-employment schedule versus 9 to 5. We pretty much have not done work, quote unquote. The work that pays the bills has not happened in about 2 to 3 weeks because we've just been 100% on house projects, which is a nice, on the one hand, it's really great to just like totally focus in on something instead of attempting to start a house project and that, try and do it a little bit Sunday and then the weather's bad and then you don't finish and whatever. But yeah, my body's sore.
So, our apartment here at the studio, I ended up doing most of the work for it. I was lucky my dad was a carpenter when I was a kid. And so, even though he became a machinist in his later career, he still has all of those carpentry skills. And so I was kind of like the do it person, and he was the this is how you do it. But I am actually really grateful for the time of the pandemic because all of those workshops were canceled. We didn't have classes in the studio. And so I had 6 months to just build us a house. Josh was working for Scud at that point, so he did have his 9 to 5 job, but it really allowed our living space to happen. And it's, I think, again, being self-employed, there's always those questions of, do we pay somebody else to do the thing? And then we have to do all this work to be able to pay them to do the thing, or do we take the time out of our other work schedule? And yeah.
Well, the bathroom we did pay someone, and gratefully, our neighbor across the street, his son is a contractor. So it's also like someone we've gotten to know and trust and feel is fair and whatnot. Only because we've done a lot of other things ourselves, but it was like, we only have one. This needs to be done
This needs to be good.
as quickly as possible. Like, we just need the toilet back in as fast as possible, Yeah,
And we are
should-
definitely in a different time and space where setting up an outhouse is not
yeah,
a
no.
feasible anything.
Mm-mm. Maybe one day when we get to the like more rural living that we kind of envision and dream of, but like in the middle of Milwaukee
Not so much.
doesn't feel like a good plan.
No.
And also like March, questionable weather, like having to go outside at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's still snowing. No,
Not
thank
so
you.
much. Yeah.
But still thinking about the move, the other part of my brain goes back to like you've got workshops going on that are kind of everywhere. So it seems like it doesn't really matter where you're living. But then for what you made,
So at that point, I was mostly selling through galleries. And so I was already packing and shipping probably 70 to 80% of the work I made left in a box to go someplace else to be sold. And even now, being in Maine, I think so about 10 years ago, again, I looked at my taxes and I was like, oh my gosh, I made this much money through galleries and they took 50%. So had I sold those pots myself, my income could be nearly doubled. And it was kind of this big, like, put on the brakes, wait a second. I love my relationships with my galleries. I feel like for me to get my work out in the world, it was kind of essential at that point in time. But at the same time, like, if I can make the same amount of money with half as many pots or make double the money with as many pots, that has kind of made sense. So I've definitely gone from the 70, 80% to galleries, 20, 30% being sold by me, and flipped that. I'm now sending less to galleries. But again, my selling myself is mostly happening online. So whether I'm in Montana, Maine, Texas, Florida, it doesn't really matter because as long as the great postal system and UPS go there, then I'm okay. So it did actually make making a move pretty easy that way because I wasn't tied to a brick and mortar in any.
Got it.
And I also wasn't doing art fairs, craft fairs, those sorts of things that are very regional. By working with galleries, again, they are the brick and mortar and I am just sending them the product. So that helped.
You read my mind because that's what I was thinking with going from not only for the social and emotional and mental support of Helena versus Maine, but also like that is a location people come knowing there are pots, knowing, it's kind of like on the one hand, is it harder to survive somewhere where there's so many potters but then on the other hand, more people come there knowing there are potters, and then vice versa, going somewhere where you don't have that community, and
Right.
how does that all work at the end of the
Yeah,
day?
and I again, for myself, I wasn't really selling locally in Helena, so it was
Didn't matter.
okay. Yeah,
Yep, that makes sense. See, this is one of those examples that things have a way of working out,
that they do.
right? I don't have a segue, actually, at all.
And that's okay. It's always interesting teaching workshops. I feel like I crossed the 100 mark a couple years ago. So I've taught a lot of workshops, which, and again, my body of work hasn't changed that dramatically over that time. So I feel like in some ways I've heard nearly every question that people tend to ask. And so when I'm presenting, I tend to answer those questions in my monologue that goes along with making the pots. And so then I'll get to that moment where I'm like, all right, does anybody have any questions? And it's just kind of this like blank stare because it's like, Martha, you already answered all of the questions we could have.
That has always been I don't know, maybe it's a strange excitement of a testimonial from students when somebody says, well, every time I had a question, the next thing you said was what I was thinking. And I was like, that means the 6 months I spent building that curriculum in that order was worth it.
Yeah,
Like, yes.
that I anticipated what would be the thing you would need and put it in there already. Yeah.
Yeah, because it makes a world of difference from a learning standpoint, at least maybe this is just my perfectionist showing. But when my brain is thinking of something and it doesn't get answered, then I'm all over the place and I can't move on from that because I'm
Right.
like, wait, hold on, I need
I
this
need
little
that
tidbit.
answer before I can do the next
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly. Well, is there something that we haven't talked about that maybe nobody ever asked you that you wish they did? Or
Oh gosh. I'm sure that there must be things. I feel like also, again, we've said several times coming off of NCECA week, there's been a lot of talk about a lot of things that nothing is springing to my brain of like, oh man, I wish somebody would ask me this particular thing. Yeah, I don't have any good things.
clearly I thought of all of the questions before. No,
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing else to be gained from Martha Grover. Hopefully that's not the case.
false. I don't believe that for a minute, and I very much want to come visit Maine.
You definitely should. I would recommend coming sometime between June and October. It is beautiful. We are headed into mud season right now, which I cannot say is the most beautiful of times. My daffodils are like half an inch. Well, before we left for NCECA, they were half an inch out of the ground, and now they have a foot of snow on top of them again because it just snowed last week like crazy.
Don't be putting that out into my universe because it's we're in the phase of it was 75 last Thursday, but now it's 29 today.
Mhm.
It was supposed to snow today. The forecast has changed, but it might snow tomorrow. And also my tulips are like some neighbors they're not blooming yet, but the leaves are way higher out of the ground. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe because mine are not as high out of the ground, it's not a reflection of my lack of gardening skills, but is actually just like they don't trust the weather yet. So we'll have them for longer.
That's a good way to look at it. They won't get their heads frozen off.
What I'm going to tell myself. But yeah, it's bananas. Well, whether it be workshops or these beautiful pieces, where on the internet do you want to send people to see what you're up to?
Let's see. So my Instagram handle is Martha H. Grover, and then my website is marthagrover.com. Those are kind of the two best places to find out what's going on and happening in the world. It actually was great while I was at NCECA. My show was Spinning Earth Gallery that Kathy Brodsky and Danny Meisinger run. And we were all out at dinner the first night, and we were kind of talking about Instagram and kind of how the algorithm keeps changing and, our frustration with it. And I was like, Danny, you post all the time. And he's like, actually, in the last however months, I've only posted this many times. And I was like, yeah, I'm kind of in that boat too. And he said, okay, month of April, we're both going to post every day, once a day, every day. So I have been thinking the last few days of what my first April 1st post is going to be. And so hopefully there will be one post a day from me again, which I actually in my artist talk, I often talk about how for about 3 years, I gave myself the assignment of post something to Instagram every day. And I feel like it did change the way that I was looking in the studio. And it made me notice what I was noticing and made me accountable in a really great way. So I'm actually kind of excited for this like month relaunch into that. And hopefully I'll be able to, stick with it and make it more than just a day or two into the month and actually post every day. So,
That's totally a different direction than I thought you were going to say when you said it made you notice things in the studio, because I was thinking of it as a negative in terms of it kind of takes you away from that flow state that we're all dreaming of hitting or whatnot. So it's really, I love this shift in perspective to say it gave you the documentation of noticing what you kept noticing in terms of choosing to document. I think that's a great script change.
I mean, it's kind of the assignment that you often get in a photography class, right? Of take a
Huh?
photo every day for a year and then see what has happened over the course of the year. And I think when I gave myself that Instagram assignment, it was before Reels existed. So it was just that visual representation of what was happening. And I think often for me, all of the editing and the kind of making things slick that seems like needs to happen on Instagram now, sort of, it's like, oh, I want to get the content, but then I know I'm going to have to spend an hour and a half, 2 hours, like editing it into this perfect 10-second thing. And so I don't have time for that hour and a half, so I'm just not going to do it. So going into this month, I think I'm going to go back to that. What are you noticing, whether it's a quick little video or just an image, and kind of seeing what that brings to mind over the course of the next 30 days. And yeah.
See, you thought we were done now, but now you've just opened up a whole nother rabbit hole. For anybody who heard me ask you where you want to go on the internet and knew that that usually signifies the end of a conversation, they're going to miss out on like all these gems. Because I'm curious, just for you, what your goal of that kind of commitment to posting is for you. Because I think for a lot of other people looking at your internet presence, they'd be like, what do you need to post every day for? You've got tens of thousands of people or, 100-person waiting list
Yeah.
for the community
Well,
studio.
I mean, part of it is so I am sitting just about at the 50K mark, and I've been sitting there for about a year and a half, 2 years. And I'm like, man, I just want to get over that next hurdle. But I also haven't been giving the platform the time and space that it needs to do that. So kind of being like, okay, this will be my get over the 50K hump. But then also, I know that I've been feeling, again, just that like, I don't want to post because it takes me so long to make a good post. And sometimes I feel like with anything, you just got to do it to make it happen, to get more comfortable with it, to not make it feel like it's a burden anymore. Because again, as we talked about earlier with finances, now that I am wanting to sell more of my pots directly, this is my platform that I let the world know that those things are available. And if I'm not growing that garden, then, will the audience continue to be there? Will there continue to be demand for me to go and teach these workshops? And so it's kind of like it's that thing that I've been neglecting that I know I shouldn't be neglecting. And that I just need to force myself to get back into it. And then all will be well. But it's that, that anticipation of like, oh, I don't want to do that thing. But then once you're doing the thing, it's okay. So,
This is like folding laundry for me. The other day, I think I did like 3 loads of laundry in one day, which was aggressive. And I dumped it all on the bed, which should be the way that forces you to fold it. There are days when it goes back in the basket, but then Francesco dumps it on the bed and takes the basket out of the room. So I have to. But it's also the point I'm trying to get to here is that it probably took me 10 minutes to fold.
but the anticipation of that 10 minutes was awful.
Exactly. The agony of looking at this pile of laundry was like, oh God, I just can't. I'm just going to put it back in the basket. But the actual amount of time it took was
Not so
comical.
bad. Yeah.
I mean, I like opened up my laptop, queued up a whatever television show, and was like, okay, well, I can watch a whole episode of, I don't know,
Whatever.
Great Pottery Throwdown or something that I don't really have to totally pay attention to and get this done.
And you got through the intro and you're like, well, shoot, I'm done.
Exactly. Exactly. So it was just like, okay, it's not the like thing in your brain is so much heavier than the reality. So
which is
Yeah,
often the case with so many things. It's just like get in and get it done, and it's not so bad. So that's going to be my April of Instagram.
I love it. I was just curious because, number one, as having, kind of, I consider you as having a known name. I consider Danny having a known name to where it's kind of like, okay, like you're out there already. People, there's a demand. But the thing I've been playing around with for me, since I'm also feeling the kind of like lack of energy for particularly Instagram, I think a lot of people have also gotten sick of it for a variety of other reasons and kind of flown the coop, if you will. So I've been testing like, well, what if, does it have to be as regular, or what if I did a lot of testing last year of like what type of post works the best for the
Hmm.
people that I'm trying to connect with. And now that I have that information, now I can be a little more selective about how much I post, because at least it's getting the eyeballs I want it to get without having to do I've never done every single day. No, I can't.
Well, we'll see what I say in a week or two. Like I said, I know I used to do it for about 3 years. It was, religious. Make sure you brush your teeth twice a day and post to Instagram and just get it done. But I don't know what it'll be like in the current environment. I also feel like I don't have those good kind of the details of what does seem to land the best. Because I feel like, again, I'll spend all this time making this what seems to me to be this perfect reel, and it'll get 5,000 views, and then I'll do like a little clip of me just running my finger up the side of something, altering it, and that gets 1 million views. And I'm like, but that was just, what the heck? I don't understand. Yeah, so kind of figuring out what's going to be that thing, I feel like I have no idea, but instead of looking at it as, what's going to get the most views, maybe again thinking about like, what am I paying attention to in the studio and how does that help the studio practice move forward? I think will be good. Of like, okay, so where am I? Can I document that regardless of where it lands in the algorithm? That you build it and they will come. Maybe, who knows? So rather than going into it and saying like, okay, so I mean, again, I do want to get over that 50K hump, but aside from that, I'm pretty close. So that shouldn't be a problem, but just having it be more for me and my practice than everybody else and their viewership.
I think that approach also keeps the energy there,
Yeah.
because there's an interest for you rather than just the metrics. Goals are important, but if we don't know why we're going after a goal, then it's kind of like, well,
Why did we bother to do that?
right. It's like, okay, well, I'm here now and nothing has changed.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. Well, I'll send you the link of my favorite strategist, which is that Allie Mason. For everybody else on Instagram, you've heard me talk about her. She's been on the podcast. She's a breath of fresh air for me in all of this, in terms of like, why am I like, give me some strategy so I can at least have a understanding of what I'm doing instead of just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. So
I will check her out.
she's great. So anyway, I will stop all talk of, if we start on a marketing conversation, I'll start brainstorming with you for the next like 2 hours.
Forget Clay.
So,
We're
right.
talking marketing now.
Yeah, well, it all comes back to what we said at the beginning of the 8 different hats we all wear. So
That is for sure.
awesome. Thank you, Martha. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca. This was lovely.
I hope this conversation with Martha has given you permission to think differently about what success in your creative business can look like. That feeling of I should be doing more is something all of us experience, especially with social media constantly showing us what everyone else is up to. But as Martha so beautifully demonstrated, setting intentional boundaries is not only okay, it's often essential for creating the space to find your own distinct artistic voice. If you're feeling pressure to grow your business beyond what feels manageable, it's okay to define what enough looks like for you. Maybe, pragmatically speaking, that looks like getting clear on your numbers and your enough revenue number. Once you hit it, you can have more freedom to say no to new projects and allow yourself time to explore new ideas. Maybe enough is limiting a teaching schedule or capping your own production work, even if that means creating a wait list that feels a little bit overwhelming. I can't think of a time when I wasn't personally wearing multiple hats. That's effectively the universal definition of being a solo business owner. We're makers, marketers, customer service reps, tax filers. The list goes on. And yes, there are plenty of times that I wish there was only one hat to be worn. But Martha's journey reminds us that balancing these roles requires conscious choices about what we say yes to and what we politely decline. Finding that balance definitely doesn't happen overnight. And if you're anything like me, it mostly happens through a lot of trial and error and perhaps overextending yourself before you realize where the boundary actually is. But through that messy process, we can find decisions that align not only with the making practice we want to have, but also, more importantly, the life we actually want to live. As always, if you're looking for help navigating this messy process in your own creative business, so that hopefully it's a little bit less messy than what took me 14 years to figure out, there are 100 makers from around the world working through it together inside of the community right now. And I know I can speak for all of them when I say we would be thrilled to have you join us. Whether it be through casual conversation amidst a virtual co-working hangout, or through a more planned discussion following one of our formal quarterly masterclasses. Classes that cover all sorts of pragmatic topics like marketing, pricing, branding, shipping, or customer service. All of these classes are included with your community membership, as is any new class or resource that gets added. And let me tell you, our resource library is growing deep. It's kind of like an MBA for artists that none of us ever got, except better, because you don't have to take the generic classes that don't actually apply to what you want to do, and the investment is radically lower. But I digress. If you want to learn more about community membership and support the creation of this podcast in the process, visit makersplaybook.com/community. And also, if all that wasn't good enough, we've got quarterly giveaways happening in there now that I haven't actually talked about publicly, including glaze supplies, thanks to our friends at Speedball. Just in case you might want to look at that link one more time, it's makersplaybook.com/community. All right, until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this. Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzfan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.